At Sheffield, I was in Yorkshire, so I wear the white rose. But the Lancastrians never associated a red rose with their cause. That was never part of it. That was invented. But we then have the Tudors come along, and they basically married the two houses together, Henry VI, or Henry VII, excuse me, for Lancaster, and Elizabeth of York, a princess of Edward IV. They unite, and they form the Tudor rose. And we see the Tudor rose everywhere. But because it's the Tudor rose, Shakespeare writes about it, and it appears everywhere, including the Temple Garden scene. So this is the scene where the Duke of York and the Duke of Somerset argue with each other in the Temple Gardens. And we have the Duke of York saying, "I will raise aloft the milk-white rose to grapple with the house of Lancaster, and I'll make them yield the crown." And the Duke of Somerset, of course, says, "Nope, let him that is no coward nor no flatterer, but dare maintain the party of truth, pluck a red rose with me." That scene never happened in real life. Never did it. That's all invented by Shakespeare. But it reinforces the red versus the white. And that just continues and continues, and that's why everything is the red rose and the white rose today. That's why we have the Wars of the Roses. It all connects back to Shakespeare. Anywhere you go in England, chances are you can find some connections. This is King's College Chapel in Cambridge, England, famous university town. And the interesting thing about King's College Chapel, it was built by all of these kings that fought and reigned and ruled in the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI, one of the greatest things he gave to England was his architecture, the colleges of King's College in Cambridge and Eton College in Windsor. And if you go inside, half of the building is covered in the iconography of the Tudors. But we have the rose everywhere, in the glass, in the stonework, in the ceilings, in the ironwork, the stained glass. Roses everywhere. It just continues to reinforce the connections. The other thing then that we have to look at is the historiography. As a historian, you need to look at primary sources, things that are contemporary to the time period, and things that have been written since. But we have to remember that opinions change over time. If we looked at a book from the Victorian period, where they were a bit stuck up, moral values, very tight-lipped society, women, you can't see any legs, whereas 1920s, we start to see that emergence. There's a difference. So if you look at a book from the Victorian period and the 1920s on the same subject, you're going to get two completely different views. Similarly, if you read a book today, completely different. So we have to look at the historiography. How did this build and move? So if we go back to the beginning, the Tudors, now victorious, we have several works that form the background. First, we have the Anglica Historia. This was written by Henry VII's own personal historian. Of course it's going to be biased and pro-Tudor. Leland's Itinerary, somewhat based off of this. Hall's Chronicle, somewhat based off of this. And guess what? Shakespeare comes along and he reads all three. So not only is Shakespeare in the Tudor period, but he's using and pulling information from Tudor sources. So what Shakespeare is telling us is naturally slanted in one direction. And here's the next Shakespeare myth. This is the famous scene at the end of Richard III where Henry Tudor proclaims all has been resolved. That in this simple act where I have taken the crown, I'm going to reunite the white rose and the red. Smile heaven upon this fair conjunction that long have frowned upon their enmity. Shakespeare makes it seem like with Henry VII winning, everything just melts away and we have no more issues. Everything's done. But there's another battle to be fought. More executions all the way to 1541. So lots more stuff still happening. It's not just a nice clean cut as Shakespeare likes to portray it. But again, he's writing in the Tudor period. how better to make the queen look good than to say, your grandfather did this amazing thing. Now that brings us to our biggest point, and that is Richard III. This is the big one. Shakespeare really did a number on Richard III. Really did a number on Richard III. So much so that there's an entire society dedicated to reestablishing Richard's image. They're called the Richard III Society. You might have heard of them. They were founded by Americans, of all people, in New York in the 1920s as, I believe, the Society of the White Boar. And they wanted to make Richard III good again and challenge all of these myths that Shakespeare brought around. And in their defense, they do a really good job in some cases. They publish a lot of material. Some of it is very, very good. They do a great job running events and things like that. However, they too are biased, obviously, in the other direction. So when Richard III was rediscovered in Leicester a couple years back, the Richard III Society just went absolutely crazy. And I was in England at the time when this was happening, so I'm watching all the news articles come in, the videos, and the lady who ran the expedition to find him, complete breakdown on national television. Like, just when she saw the deformed spine, you thought she was gonna jump off a bridge. Like, and the things that they showed in that documentary that she was doing, it's just a little too far. I get it that, you know, this is the holy grail for you guys, for the Richard III Society, but wow. Those documentaries are on YouTube, so if you look up the search for Richard III or something like that, you will find those documentaries, and you might get my point. But they do a nice job as well. So we now have point and counterpoint going on. So there's a lot of books coming out. Who's telling the right story?
Now, is that Richard III's skull?
Yes, it is. So this is him from a painting in the early 1500s. And then they found the dig, and using the technology that they had, digital scanning, police units do the work where if they get a skull, they can mold and manipulate the muscle contours, and they can basically recreate the face. And they did exactly that. And they, based off of this scan, they recreated the king's face. And it's actually pretty close, in a way. Of course, here he has a nice smirk. He doesn't seem so evil now, does he? But this type of stuff is fascinating, just because it makes it much more real. You can have a connection with what you're studying. But the first thing that Shakespeare was big about, Shakespeare talked about Richard being this monster. Deformed, one shoulder lower, that's the famous one that we're also familiar with. He's hunchbacked. Lo and behold, it was true. When they discovered Richard in the car park, he had scoliosis, quite severe. So they thought that based on medical cases that it probably developed or hindered his development in certain ways. But then there was a documentary that came out, and they found somebody with the exact same curvature of the spine, and they put him in armor, and they had him do what Richard had to do, and he actually did it quite well. That documentary is on YouTube as well, by the way. Another British production. Absolutely amazing. They put him in the saddle. On a normal saddle, he wasn't able to ride properly. But they readjusted the saddle for him, and he led a cavalry charge. So the whole idea that Richard was incapable of doing things, I think, has been put to rest based on some of that research. Of course, this is all still growing because this has only been the past couple of years. Most importantly, though, it could be hidden. So most likely, this could have been discovered when Richard III was killed, because they stripped the king of all his clothes, slung him over the back of a horse, and marched him back into Leicester where they buried him.
Was it the belief of or is it the belief of not known more, but was it the belief of the Richard III Society that he was not disabled or
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, that's why she went into such shock when she saw that. She's like, no, it can't be. It can't be. Yeah. Yep, so that has now been confirmed. So Shakespeare actually tells us the truth in that sense. But that he is this completely deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and so lame that dogs bark at me. That's not true. So Shakespeare goes a little too far with that. If you want a really good depiction of that, you can watch the Lawrence Oliver version of Richard III from 1955. A really good take on the Shakespearean play with that evilness in mind. The princes in the tower. Who's familiar with the princes? Anyone? A little bit? Okay. So, if we look at our kingly timeline, Richard, Duke of York, that one who challenged for the throne, he never got to taste the crown himself. He was actually killed before he could. So it fell to his son, Edward, and he became Edward IV, King of England. Edward was a pretty good king. He ruled well, he did a lot of stuff. He had 2 sons, an heir and a spare. Perfect. These would have been the next 2 to inherit the throne. The problem is, Edward IV died before his sons became of age. This goes back to the whole...
Of age would have been what age?
15, 16, capable of making some decisions. It's funny how that age number changes depending. But we saw this before, Henry VI. He was King of England at 9 months. He had a council rule for him until he became of age, but look how that ended. So is that going to happen again? So that's the argument of the Richard III Society. Richard III took the throne to prevent England from going back into the Wars of the Roses. So instead of the rightful king, Edward, Prince of Wales, it became Richard. Okay, fine. But then what happened to the 2 princes? We know that they were put into the Tower. Richard III argues for their protection. Others say to keep them in one spot, to keep an eye on them. But then they disappear. The 2 princes go missing, and they're never found again. So, immediately there's rumors that they've been murdered, and Richard then claims the throne for himself. Richard becomes Richard III. What happened to the princes in the tower? That's the tale that the beefeaters at the tower love to talk about. Let's go look at the bloody tower where the princes were murdered, and so on and so on. Who did it, though? History most likely points to Richard III. Others say Henry VII, the Duke of Buckingham, Margaret Beaufort, other supporters of various groups. Most likely, though, just like with Henry VI getting murdered in the tower, that was under Edward's authority. Richard was the next king. He became king as a result. That could be a pretty good argument for removing the princes. In any case, they weren't found again. There were some cases where pretenders emerged. I am the prince. I escaped, and here I am to claim my throne again. Turns out it was a Dutch merchant model selling clothes. In 1674, workmen were digging in this particular stairwell, and they found the bones of 2 children. The king at the time ordered them collected and interned at Westminster Abbey, where you can see them to this day, behind Elizabeth I. They did test them in the early 1900s to see kind of, is it really them? And they did confirm that they're the correct ages, but they were mixed with animal bones, all sorts of stuff is in that container that they're in. People want to pull them back out now because of all the stuff we have available to us, all the technology. We should be able to get an answer. The Queen refuses. It sets a precedent of if we let people dig up one monarch, who's to say that everybody else is going to get dug up? So everyone keeps going at that. The Richard III Society has now made this their new mission. Most likely to prove it so that Richard III didn't kill them, but
Edward, Elizabeth Prince, he really was the king, uncrowned, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so he would have been, he's listed as Edward V.
Correct.
But
he never had a coronation.
Yeah, right.
So he never had a crown. In some cases, you won't see him in the series of monarchs. In other cases, you will. So in this player's cigarette booklet, he is represented. But in other cases, I've seen him not be there whatsoever because he never had the crown and never had the coronation ceremony. So it depends on the source that you look at.
But the next one on was Henry VI. I mean, they didn't.
Exactly.
They missed over, you know, they
Right,
they skipped over the number then.
Right.
Everybody was moving ahead.
And there was a purpose behind that because that reinforced that they were the rightful. He was the rightful Edward, because the queen that sired the Tudor dynasty was the sister of these two. So again, it's all about the politics game. Who's got the connections, who is really king and who isn't. So having those connections helps, and that's what they played up on. So that's why it became Edward VI. That's a good point. So I put this in green because, we don't know. We really don't. Shakespeare, of course, in Richard III says, or he has Sir James Tyrrell, Richard's right-hand man, come in and say, the tyrannous and bloody act is done, the most arch deed of piteous massacre that ever yet this land was guilty of. Well, we just had the Battle of Towton. That wasn't bad enough, apparently. So we're kind of stretching it here, but this might be one of the great unanswerable questions of history. We might not ever be able to figure this out unless they decide to open this up and explore some more. But the interesting thing is, now with the discovery of Richard III and the DNA and the component, the structural setup of the cells, he is related to them. So if you find some of the similar DNA, I believe it's the mitochondrial DNA, if it's similar and there's a connection, that changes things completely, perhaps. So who knows where that will go. And then the other big one that we have is that Richard III was a coward. He wasn't as brave as he was made out to be. We have the most famous scene, I think, of Richard III, and the most famous quote that we get from Shakespeare, my horse, a kingdom for a horse." Basically trying to flee the battle or to mount and ride off a horse, whatever it may be. So that brings us to the Battle of Bosworth. This is the penultimate battle of the Wars of the Roses. It's the battle that most historians like to bookend and say, this is where the Wars of the Roses ended. Again, I contest it does not, but to keep things clean, that's the end point. Richard was king at the time. He had a very strong following, 10,000 plus. He had the artillery. He had Burgundian gunners. Burgundy was providing some of the best firearms at the time, so to have those in your army was really, really good. The Tudors were only 5,000. And of that, a very small amount were actually English. The rest were mercenaries, usually a bad sign. Because they're not fighting for their country, they're fighting for money. So mostly French. And he did have some Welsh forces as well. If you're familiar with the Welsh flag nowadays, it's white and green with the red dragon. That ties directly back to Henry Tudor. White and green are the Tudor colors, and the red dragon is the dragon of Cadwallader, which Henry Tudor connected himself to. And then we have the Stanleys, this third party, neither for nor against. They sit on the side and they watch the battle happen. And then at the critical point, they charge in and make their allegiance known. So, Richard III realizes that he's not getting the battle he wants, and he sees Henry's standard fluttering down below. He's up on a hill, and he knows that Henry is nearby, and he figures, if I can kill Henry, I can end this right now. And Richard III declares a cavalry charge, charges down the hill, and annihilates Henry's banner bearers, knocks him off his horse and kills him dead. Richard III fights very, very well. He's eventually dehorsed, though. He loses his momentum. And at that crucial point where he's within reach of Henry Tudor, of killing him, the Stanleys, with their 6,000, charge in favor of Henry Tudor. And so Richard's army starts to fall apart, and Richard finds himself absolutely surrounded. His own banner bearer actually has both legs hewn from under him. So the Shakespeare myth that he wanted a horse, that he wanted to flee after he became dismounted, most likely not true. Richard went and fought on. He actually said, I will die a king, or I will either win or die a king at this day. So he was basically gambling everything. And the chroniclers at the time, including pro-Tudor ones, said King Richard alone was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press.
Where do you get that quote from, or that I will die a king, or what's the source on that?
It's a tricky one. It comes from, for such an important battle, there's really not a lot that survives, but there are some chronicles that covered it. There's a song called The Song of Lady Bess, and then there's one more, both of which cover it. So it's that wording, but it's changed in every source. Shakespeare mentions it as well, so even Shakespeare has grabbed onto it. But out of all the battles, it is the least covered, but yet the most interesting one, just for everything that happened. But the myth, again, is that Richard fought until the very end. And based on that documentary and the testing that they did with someone with scoliosis in armor, you do have the ability to fight, albeit for a short period of time. And that brings us to the final point, just a nice way to summarize these myths. The later 15th century in England is now seen as a ruthless and violent age as concerns the upper ranks of society. Full of private feuds, intimidation, land hunger, the consideration of Richard's life and career against this background has tended to remove him from the lonely pinnacle of villainy incarnate on which Shakespeare has placed him. Like most men, he was conditioned by the standards of his age. And that perfectly summarizes everything, because if we look at it from today's standards, he is a horrible person. If we look at it at that time period, Richard did what was expected. And it was Shakespeare writing from the victor's standpoint, the Tudors, that, and obviously his success, allowed that myth to just grow and grow and grow to what we have today. So hopefully when you walk into the Courier and you get to see the folio, now you can at least say, but aha, there's some myths here that we have explored and debunked, and hopefully that makes us all the better for it. So that is what I have for this discussion. I do appreciate you guys listening. We do now, however, have some additional time for questions and answers if there are any. And of course, I did bring artifacts up here, so you're more than welcome to come up, take a look at them. They're all connected to Shakespeare and the Wars of the Roses in some way. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Unless I've done a great job and no one has any questions. That's okay too. Nothing?